listening to this show, and he has his mighty hammer. And one of the things about his hammer is that when he threw it, other than never missing, it would always come back to him. Okay, that's Thor's hammer. In Australia, there's something called the woomerang, better known as the boomerang. Another weapon, once thrown, always will return to the owner. Well, there is a legend in Australia about the Wakari brothers who castrated this one god because he tried to have relations with the women of the earth. And they used the boomerang to castrate him. In Greek mythology, we have Kronos with his sickle, which looks surprisingly like a boomerang, castrating his father because he wanted to have relations with the earth. Or that was the ploy, was when he was having relationships with the earth. And then in Sumerian mythology, we have Enlil with his sickle, and it's a weapon without of splendor. You know, and so we have parallel myths, but we also have parallel weapons. You know, mythologists try to say, well, it's forces of nature, or it's, you know, levels of consciousness. But if I was asked to make up a story about a fictitious god, if you said, you know, make up a story about something that is creating the thunder, and then I asked you, hey, Nick, make up a story about what's creating the thunder, we wouldn't come up with a story that was almost the same.
No, that's right. That's very true. That's true. Well, that kind of leads me into another question. The fact that they had these weapons and they had an effect, that would sort of suggest more like that these things aren't, or these entities aren't sort of all-powerful, omnipotent beings, but are sort of far more close, physically at least, in terms of having a biology rather than being some sort of ethereal, supernatural creature. They seem far closer to us. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%.
Okay.
When you start talking about the gods, they could die. They killed each other. I mean, so if you can kill each other, you can die. And then they had like amazing weapons that could do all kinds of things. You know, and when we think of God, God should be able to, like, you know, wave his wand or wave his hand and something should magically appear, or wink his eyes or wiggle his nose, and something should happen. Not so much for these gods. They had weapons. They had ships, you know, that they flew around in. All the things that we think of in the modern world. I mean, they had technology. One of my favorite things about the gods is that, you know, and this sounds really bad, but, you know, it's about the gods. You know, they were always in search of immortality. You know, they found substances that would help to increase their lifespan. We were unable to nail that down and get a smoking gun. We did come up with some ideas surrounding it. But one of the things that we laughed about in our studying is that they were always out looking for it, and then they would fight over it. You know, things like Amrita, which is, you know, or ambrosia, you know, these nectars of the gods. And they would fight and kill and deceive and rip each other off to get it. You know, and people think of God as being all kind and loving and wonderful, and no, they just killed this guy to steal his stuff, you know.
But a lot of it sort of circulated around sort of longevity and immortality and things like that.
To a certain extent, you know, and I'll just say it, you know, one of the things that, you know, I don't want to say we based the book on, but, you know, we had read the Sitchin material, and so that was kind of in the back of our head. We really did not and chose specifically not to use it as a reference, but it's just back there because we've read them all, you know, so you can't, like, delete them. And, you know, we went looking for the gold because that was supposedly why they were here, and we couldn't find the gold. The only thing we could find sort of tied to the gold were some stories, not a ton, but some stories that implied that the gold had a connection to immortality.
Okay.
But not a smoking gun.
Okay.
Bad to say.
All right. Well, just to sort of backtrack a little bit to one thing you brought up earlier about Mars. I mean, do you feel that, the information you're presenting in the new book, in Man-Made, do you feel that the whole issue of things like the face on Mars, the so-called pyramids on Mars, does this come into play with this particular scenario, when you're talking about life being brought to the planet in the distant past?
I think it increases the possibility that the structures up there are real. Mm-hmm. There is one story that comes out of South America that talks about the adjusters. And they were the first builders in the very first world. And when the world was coming to an end, they came out from their mountains and the sunlight hit them and they turned to stone. And the quote goes, and you can still see the faces of these gods on the planet, on the surface of the planet. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay. And I have to tell you, when I found that myth, I had already worked up the whole Mars mm-hmm. piece. And I was like, well, that's pretty fitting.
Do you sort of subscribe? I know this is sort of going off a little bit as a tangent, but do you subscribe to this idea that there could still be some sort of life on Mars?
Good question. Well, when you start dealing with some of this stuff, there's like what your logical mind, according to the science that we've been fed all these years says, and then there's what that little intuitive mind says. Much of the life that actually existed on the Earth through much of its history either existed underground or underwater. Okay? They really did not live on the surface. And so whether a culture could be living underground on Mars, I do think so. Okay. One of the comments that I've made, and, sometimes I just throw out these little one-liners that may or may not have anything to do with anything, but when we sent those rovers up there and they kept getting knocked out of the sky or they crashed or, it took us a while to actually land something there. Mm-hmm. My little off-cuff comment was, well, I wonder if the Martians are shooting them out of the sky.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe they are.
Maybe they came up with some kind of an agreement. Don't go to these areas. I mean, have you noticed that they send these rovers up there, but they never go to the Cydonia area?
Yeah,
I mean, what's with that? I want to see what's there. You want to see what's there, but nah, nobody's interested. It's like, yeah, we are.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel that, if we actually did sort of a really in-depth study of these anomalous areas, that potentially we might actually find more clues about the sort of stuff you're writing about?
I think so. I mean, I feel like, what we put out there was extremely circumstantial in its nature. But when you look at the weird coincidences that were tied to Mars's history and then our own, and the mythology that kind of goes around that first period, it seems like it is very possible. Okay. I'll give it very possible. Okay.
Well, that's better than nothing. I mean, I think we all kind of agree, who are interested in these topics, that there's no doubt, that there are some very weird, strange-looking things on the surface of Mars. These banyan trees, the face on Mars, the pyramids, a whole range of things, which I think I would agree with you. I think there's evidence, or even if it's circumstantial, that something is going on up there, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
All righty, Rita.
Well, and I'm gonna throw one more little thing out.
Sure.
They came out, years ago. It's like, oh well, we have this Mars rock that has an early form of bacteria. Mm. Remember that whole big whoop thing? Okay, and we were talking about the gold a little bit, and this is part of that chapter where I go into this whole discussion about ochre, which, I don't know that we need to go there, but this whole discussion about ochre. And one of the things that we uncovered was that ochre, red ochre, Is it ochre? Yeah. Like that they used in the cave paintings, and they use it in Egypt to paint everything red ochre, is made when blue-green algae, okay, which is a plant, and so when it would breathe, it would breathe in carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. Well, on the Earth, in particular, when it exhaled the oxygen mixed with free-floating iron that was in the water on the planet. And when the free-floating iron is mixed with oxygen, we recognize it as rust, but it also, when it gravitates down to the bottom of the water, is what forms ochre. One of the things scientists have discovered in the last 15 years that the red color of Mars is the product of the planet being covered with ochre. Well, you can't be covered with ochre unless you have blue-green algae or some kind of bacterial plant life living there. And water.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Duh. So they kind of like skip parts. It's like, they can't have, it's like, well, that's kind of basic science unless you don't look at it.
All righty. Well, that's probably a good time and a good place for us, Rita, to take a break. We've got to take a short commercial break, only a few minutes, and we've still got plenty of questions, so we won't be gone long. And this is just also a reminder to our audience. You can visit our website and find out more about Epic at epicvoyages.com, or visit our YouTube channel, Epic Voyages, for free video presentations, and we'll be back very shortly. Hi, this is Nick Redfern again. Thanks again for joining us on Epic Voyages. You can find out more about us at epicvoyages.com or visit our YouTube channel, Epic Voyages, for free video presentations. And as you'll know from before the break, we're speaking with Dr. Rita Louise about her new book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. Now, Rita, to kind of get back to the some of the early stages of this whole situation with these sort of higher entities from at least somewhere else coming here, can you talk about some of the stuff that you reference quite deeply in the book about, the idea of the human race sort of being bioengineered, if you like, rather than creation or evolution, that we were actually somehow manufactured, I guess might be a good way to put it.
We're man-made. Well, alien-made. I didn't think that would be a good title, alien-made, because people would get that even less. One of the things that we learned from mythology is that there was a group of giants that lived on the earth, and they were considered the lesser gods. And they really got tired of doing all the work. And one of the myths tells us that, they too were the children of the gods, and why should they have to do all of this backbreaking labor? And so it was decided, through a number of different potential scenarios, that they would create a race of worker beings that would pick up the work and the slack of this lesser group of gods, a.k.a. they made man. And what's interesting is that I have a cat that wants to climb on my desk, and I have all of this, speaker equipment everywhere, and it's like, no. Anyway, what's interesting is that when they go to make man, they actually try several times to do it. And one of the things that I found interesting is that even in the biblical narrative of creation, if you actually read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of Genesis, there's two different creation stories. And it has been theorized by some, not a lot of people, but I like this theory best myself, was that what they were hoping to do was to explain the fact there were actually multiple creations that occurred. And that concept does seem to prove out in different mythologies. When they would make, in the earlier forms, in the version 1, man 1.0, they had physical issues. They couldn't stand up straight. They couldn't urinate. They couldn't reproduce. They kept trying and they kept trying until they finally created mankind in his current form. And when I say his current form, and see, my husband, my co-author, I keep saying husband, I should say co-author, Wayne La Liberty. He goes, you're just going to get persecuted for this one by both the religious people and the ancient alien people as well, is that we believe that this creation period actually happened somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million, not billion, million years ago. One of the things that myth tells us is, such as in the story of Prometheus, Prometheus gives man fire. And that story of the gods giving man fire is found around the world. It's a trickster god. It is a animal god, but there's always some issue around this god doing this act. Man didn't figure out how to make fire. He didn't rub two sticks together. He was given fire by the gods. But there are other characteristics that we see as far as being mankind. We walk upright. We don't have any body hair. And in the book, it goes into more detail of all of these different characteristics. But where all of these characteristics come in together, including wearing clothes. When Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God gives them a set of furs to wear. God makes them clothes out of fur. Where all of these very primitive skill sets come together is with Homo erectus, and we date it fairly late, 1.5 million years ago. And there are a lot of people that are like, it's 40,000 years ago. They might push it back, 100,000 years ago. But if you let the mythology be the guide and go, when did man learn to use fire? When did man, because the gods also taught mankind how to use tools. Well, when was the first tool used? Well, it was that Stone Age people back, 1.5 million years ago. And that we came to the conclusion because once you start looking in that time period, the time period kind of starting with Australopithecus and moving forward, Nick, I was talking about Mars and it being kind of circumstantial. But when you start looking at the genetic changes in mankind since that time, and I just want to touch on a couple of these. One is something called the FOXP2 gene, which is associated with language. It had not changed for 70 million years, that original FOXP2 gene. But then around 200,000 years ago, 2 mutations happened, which gave us the ability to speak. So... You know what? I think I have a typo there. I think it's supposed to be 2 million years ago, and it says 200,000. Okay. I'm going to put a little note there for myself, because I still...
So are you saying then that... Oh, go on, yeah.
Okay, so then, then there is a gene called the MHPH gene, which is associated with brain size. And so, we have the little... Australopithecus brain, and then somehow, somewhere, some reason, we got this big brain. And they were waiting to find the missing link, but maybe the link's not missing. But during that time period, we inherited this MHPH gene, which wasn't there before. But it keeps going. Then again, about 37,000 years ago, with the rise of what is considered, Neolithic man, the Cultural Revolution, there was a variant of that same MHPH gene that shows up in people. Right when we needed it, it showed up. Or, It just is too coincidental. It's like we make this change, and there's this new gene that we're expressing. And then there was another gene, something called the ASPM gene, that has come into the gene pool somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, right at the advent of civilization as we know it.
Okay.
And so there are these genetic changes that hadn't been experienced in the history of life on this planet, that in our lineage has been boom, 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 and the side effect of these genetic changes is us. But that is counter to the whole idea of evolution.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay. And sort of following on from that point, in terms of, this whole scenario, the entire investigation, is there anything that sort of really surprised you, that you didn't really anticipate, when you were doing this sort of research?
We were really surprised. Our original belief, or the one we were trying to hang on to, was that there had been a earlier human. You have to really get clear. Human civilization that built the pyramids, that did whatever they did, and they were taken out. That was our initial belief. Wayne and I really didn't come into this whole thing being, the whole idea of, ancient aliens. I mean, we agree with that, but we didn't think that it, one, went so far back in time, and two, played such a big role in the creation and development of who we are on this planet.
Okay.
So we were a little taken aback because, we were just kind of figuring, they showed up, 100,000 years ago, maybe 1 million years ago, kind of dinked with Homo erectus, and boom, here we are. But that's not what we found.
Well, but then again, by the same token, you can only go with what you find, so you're taking the honest approach. If something, throws something into the works and changes it, it's good that you've sort of embraced that and taken it on board. It's not like you're saying, we're not going to look at another alternative angle because we didn't anticipate it. You know what I mean? So.
Well, I think it was really important for us to report what we found.
Yeah.
And take ourselves really out of the equation. And I have to tell you, we got to certain points, like that gold thing. I was for sure that this gold thing, I was going to find all of this evidence about it. And I spent a month. And I mean, we were talking about this OCD month where it was online 12 and 14 hours a day for a month. And Nick, I couldn't find the gold. I couldn't find it. Really pissed me off, but I couldn't find it.
Well, like I said, you can only find, or go looking for what you can find. I mean, and if you don't find it, question why and follow the other path then, I guess. So. All right, well, we've been on almost an hour, Rita, incredibly. And I'm sure at this point people want to know, obviously, where, they can get hold of your book. And again, just to remind people, it's called Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods. So if you could tell people where the book's available, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. It's not yet. Okay, so, and I want to thank you, Nick, because this is my totally first interview even talking about the book, other than in my garage and to my friends who are thinking I'm totally nuts with this topic. Anyway, but we are starting a pre-release, and so people can go to www.manmadethechronicles. That's Man-Made the Chronicles. And if they're interested in getting a copy, we are taking pre-order sales on that website as well as on the soulhealer.com website. And anyone that does buy a pre-order copy, they will get their shipping for free. And this part's priceless, it will be signed by the authors.
There you go.
Oh!
Well, you can't ask for better than that, can you?
I don't think so.
So I know so.
We would love for people to, we encourage people to go to the site, take a look at what's there. I mean, not a ton, but something, and pre-order the book. The anticipated release date is October. We think about October 15th. It will take a little bit of time for it to proliferate into Amazon. And so your best bet is to go to the soulhealer.site or Man-Made the Chronicles.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, we're just coming up to the top of the hour, Rita, and we're going to open things up for questions now. So if anybody's listening and you have any questions, either contact us through the live chat room or call in on the toll-free number, which is 1-888-919-2355. That's 1-888-919-2355. And obviously, Rita, while we're waiting for questions to come through, we can just sort of continue and carry on with this sort of conversation. And one of the things, while we are just waiting for a few questions, you mentioned briefly about some of these fantastic creatures in the past, like the Cyclops and, strange creatures that sound sort of semi-human but not human. And when you're talking about some genetic manipulation and different, sort of levels and types of people, etc., do you think some of these could be distorted stories of where, these attempts to make the perfect human actually went sort of catastrophically wrong?
When you talk about the Cyclopses, they are identified as being the children of the god. They're not the creation of the god, even though there are some people that speculate, and this isn't what the mythology says, but, it's not a really big leap to go there, that they might have been genetically engineered from the gods. When you get down to mankind, we're kind of talking about a third iteration. One of the things that we kind of came to a conclusion on is that these gods had issues living on the surface of the planet. When you hear stories of them, they are in the sky, in their ships. And these ships were, or what they called, in some cultures, heaven, where heaven is the ship, that place up there beyond where the birds go, where the gods live, in these boats or in these, these homes. In the Mahabharata, it talks about these sabas, and these things are 500 by 300 yonas in dimension. But a yonas is the distance a mule can walk throughout the course of a day, which is estimated at 5 to 12 miles. And so we're talking about this thing that is 500 times minimally 5 miles by 300 times 5 miles. We're talking about a Star Wars Death Destroyer vehicle that's flying around over the planet, or they're identified as being, in the earth, in the mountains. I find it interesting that they're finding all of this tunneling and these underground caverns, in the mountains, which parallels mythology, which is where the giants live, the dwarfs, the creators of the technology lived.
Yeah. Okay.
And under the water, but not on the surface. The second group of giants, not the Titan giants who were the size of mountains, but the giants that people are more familiar with, these 9 to 12 foot people, actually could live on the surface of the planet. They were the earthborn.